Assalamu ala man ittaba al-huda. Good evening and thank you all for coming to this, I believe, very, very pertinent and relevant talk. It's also an honor for me to be here. It's actually been a long time since I have come to your city of Birmingham. I came once before, around 23 years ago, to visit my brother who used to live here. And this is actually the first time I'm coming as a speaker. So it is indeed a great honor for me to be in this very historic city. Today's talk is, of course, entitled, Is ISIS Islamic? And whenever we talk about ISIS, really the question arises, where does one even begin to talk about this rather modern phenomenon? And my goal today is to begin a conversation, begin a dialogue, and I'm going to divide my talk into three broad areas. Firstly, we'll talk a little bit about the rise of ISIS and its relationship to the religion of Islam. Secondly, some context as to where is this phenomenon coming from. And then thirdly, some points about what all of us can and should be doing about ISIS. ISIS is, of course, an acronym for a new group that now exists in Iraq. It is an extremist rebel group that now controls large swaths of Iraq and Syria. ISIS is officially a breakaway offshoot of Al-Qaeda, i.e. it was formed as Al-Qaeda of Iraq back in the mid-2000s, and then eventually it broke away from Al-Qaeda because of increasing disagreements, both theological and methodological. Although the actual players and founders behind ISIS remain murky and hide behind rather fanciful nom de guerres, it appears that it began its military operations from as early as 2008 and achieved phenomenal success, in particular when it captured the city of Mosul. The city of Mosul is one of the largest cities of Iraq, comparable in size, probably actually even larger than the city of Birmingham. And in the month of June 2014, ISIS announced a global caliphate, thus heralding in a new phenomenon that the Muslim world had not seen since the collapse of the caliphate back in 1927. All analysts are surprised and shocked at how successful ISIS has been politically. In a very short period of time, they have, for all intents and purposes, established a functioning state, a functioning government body. Its employees, and it has employees, are salaried with health benefits, by the way. It actually has its own court systems. It has multiple ministries that, in fact, is running the territories that it's controlling. It has court systems that resolve internal disputes between members of the public. It has other tangible forms of government. There is even talk of issuing its own currency. This is a version of a terrorist organization that we have not hitherto seen. An organization that has achieved a modicum of political success and independence, albeit one that is not officially recognized by any other country in the world. But of course, all of this is irrelevant to what ISIS really is. What really shot it to fame is, of course, its sheer brutality and inhumanity. I do not need to list for you the gruesome realities of this terrorist organization, from its taped and broadcasted beheadings, to its reintroduction of slavery, to its treatment for all those whom it disagreed with, to its attempts to expel and massacre various minority populations such as the Yazidis of Iraq, and its brutal treatment of the Shiites, and so on and so forth. And what we see now of this new organization, ISIS, what we see of its tactics are unprecedented in the history of our religion. Muslims the world over have continued to criticize ISIS and dissociate from its tactics. The senior clerics and the grand muftis of every single Islamic country have publicly condemned it from its very inception. And perhaps the most significant and high-profile response was a very public letter that was issued to the quote-unquote caliph, and it's literally called a letter to the caliph, that in apostrophe, quotation marks, al-Baghdadi, and it has its own website, you can Google it, a letter to the caliph, and it was signed by over 120 leading clerics of the Islamic world, and there were just a handful of American clerics in that one, and I'm honored to have my name on that list as well. I was also of the signatories of this letter against al-Baghdadi. And al-Baghdadi is, of course, the quote-unquote alleged caliph. And this letter, which is a very detailed, dense Islamic document, basically deconstructs the understanding of Islam that ISIS has. And it challenges ISIS's interpretation of jihad and of their killings of people and of their treatments of non-Muslims and so on and so forth. Truth be told, the fact of the matter is that there is not a single reputable cleric in the entire world that has endorsed ISIS. And that is a fact that is beyond dispute. ISIS has been roundly criticized by every single leader in the Muslim world, except for its own group of followers, which barely number 20,000. Other than ISIS itself, there is not a single cleric of any stripe of Sunni or Shiite or Sufi Islam that has endorsed or sanctioned this radical regime. So the question therefore is ISIS Islamic? Well, the problem with the question is that the question actually can be answered in multiple ways. If by Islamic you mean coming from within the realm of Islam by people who claim to be following it, well then ISIS claims to be Islamic. Because the term ISIS, I stands for the Islamic State. So ISIS claims to be Islamic. Its people claim to be Muslim. And it uses the vernacular and terminology of Islam. It's quoting the Quran. It's quoting the traditions of the Prophet. And outwardly, yes, it is appearing to be Islamic. But at the same time, if you ask, is ISIS Islamic from an adjective perspective, i.e., is it acting in accordance with the teachings of Islam? Well then, you have for yourself the undeniable reality that the vast majority of the Muslim world has publicly dissociated itself from this version of its religion. So who gets to speak for Islam? A small group of radicals that represent less than 0.0001% of the Muslim world, or the bulk of the Muslim world, 99.999%? Who really gets to speak for the faith? And the fact of the matter is, if you simply want to look at numbers, ISIS has probably up to maximum 25,000 fighters in its ranks. That represents, quite literally, I calculated it out, 0.00125% of the Muslim world. To give you a sense of contrast, the KKK, the organization here in America, at its peak in 1920, had a registered following of 4 million people. These are those who paid their dues, were official members. We're not talking about sympathizers, which probably at least were triple or quadruple. The registered number of people that officially followed the doctrines of and paid their dues to KKK, and this is at the height of the lynchings. We're not talking about its inception where, no, 1920s, is around 4 million. And America had a population of around 105 million in 1920. This would make the KKK representative of 3.8% of our country, USA. And contrast 3.8% with 0.00125. If ISIS is Islamic, then the KKK is 3,000 times more Christian and American. Think about that. If you want ISIS to represent Islam, then quite literally, I've done the math for you, 3,000 times more it is legitimate to say that KKK represents America. But who amongst us would say that? We wouldn't, because the KKK has always been a fringe minority, even though its members view themselves as being the bastion of, the vanguard of, the patriotic, if you like, descendants of the Confederates. They view themselves as being the most patriotic Americans. But it doesn't matter. The bulk of the country has dissociated from them. Even in the 1920s, when they were at their peak, they were still a small minority. How fair is it to call the KKK American? The question also begs itself, how fair is it to call ISIS Islamic? Nonetheless, from our perspective as American Muslims, even 20,000 is too much, way too much. And we're all distressed, and we're angry, and we're scared even when we hear of stories of a handful of American teenagers. And this community itself has also been afflicted with one such case of teenagers running away and joining this group. So the question arises, indeed, ISIS is a fringe within Islam. But then where is it coming from? Why do we have ISIS in 2015? What exactly has happened to bring about this rather bizarre interpretation of Islam that the history of our religion has never seen? And again, that is a fact that I ask you to research. We've never had a group in our 14 and a half centuries that has practiced Islam in just a bizarre manner. And a simple manifestation of that, the very fact that ISIS is now killing Shiites in Iraq and expelling Yazidis in Iraq, these are people that have lived in Iraq for over 1,000 years under an actual caliphate, i.e. a legitimate bona fide caliphate in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th Islamic centuries. We've had legitimate caliphates in Iraq 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. These minorities were there. The very fact that ISIS has the luxury of targeting these minorities demonstrates previous legitimate Islamic caliphates tolerated them. So the question therefore arises, what is going on? Where is ISIS coming from? And what even makes the question even more perplexing is that, by and large, Iraq in particular had never seen these types of cultish, messianic Islamic movements. If you look at the history of even modern Islam, one does find radical groups popping up in various places like Egypt or whatnot, but Iraq, by and large, had never, ever had such a movement. So what's happening in the last 20, 30 years that explains the rise of ISIS from within the context that it has arisen? Therefore, we now need to go to the second phase of my talk, and that is the context. What exactly is happening that might perhaps make us explain, help us explain this phenomenon? It is remarkable to note that the Iraq of the 60s and 70s is barely recognizable as having anything to do with the Iraq of 2015. In fact, the Iraq of the 60s and 70s, even up until the 80s, was one of the most, if not the most, developed and advanced country in the Middle East. It had literacy rates, even amongst females, and we're talking about in the 70s. Its literacy rates was in the high 80 and low 90%. The University of Baghdad, every Arab sitting here knows this. The University of Baghdad is one of the most prestigious, I should say, was one of the most prestigious universities of post-World War II Arab world. And in fact, it was the envy of many Arab countries. The infrastructure, the health facilities of Iraq were the envy of the Arab world. Frankly, the Iraq of today can barely be recognized as having anything to do with the Iraq of yesteryears. So what exactly has happened? And by the way, there are a number of beautiful photographs floating around the internet, which basically has the same street in Baghdad, the same street in Iraq, 1970, 1980, and then today. And the question arises, well, what exactly happened? What happened in the last 25, 30 years that has brought Iraq, which was really the pinnacle of the Middle East in terms of its civilization, in terms of every single mechanism of judging civilization, whether it's healthcare, whether it's GDP, whether it's literacy. There is no question that Iraq was amongst the top in the entire Arab world. What has happened that has caused Iraq to go from where it was to what it is today? Well, no doubt, the first sign of decline began in the almost decade-long war between Iraq and Iran, which dominated the 1980s. Those of us here that are older than 35, 40 years old, you remember the 80s was full of always the Iran-Iraq war. Now, of course, back in the 80s, of course, Saddam Hussein was an ally of our country. And we were the ones who basically sold him plenty of weapons, including chemical weapons, by the way. And there's video footage of our foreign minister at the time, none other than Donald Rumsfeld, going to Iraq and selling Saddam Hussein weapons, because at that time he was our ally. We really didn't care that he was gassing the Kurds. We didn't care that he was killing his own people or killing Iranians. He was our ally. And anybody who's an ally of ours, we overlook anything that he happens to be doing at the time. So we financed that war against Iran. And Iraq became one of the largest customers that we had in the Middle East that are buying our weapons. We're supplying them with everything that they need. Of course, that kind of sort of hitched up in the late 80s when it was discovered that not only were we selling to Iraq, surreptitiously we were also selling to Iran. And so we were brokering a war in the Middle East, selling weapons to both of these countries at the same time. Most of you might remember the Iran-Contra scandal under Reagan. Just as we were selling weapons of mass destruction to Iraq, At the very same time, we were financing and selling quite directly, if you look at the reality of the Iran-Contra scandal, weapons to Iran as well. And the Iraq-Iran war was the beginning of the end for Iraq. And over 5 million people on both sides basically died in this war. Now, of course, after the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam Hussein decided to invade the very small province of Kuwait, which had only recently gained independence around 25, 30 years ago. That's another tangent of history that we don't have time to get into. And Saddam's reasoning, and again, this is not in any way an endorsement of his reasoning, I'm simply quoting a statement of fact that he said that he viewed Kuwait as having been a province of Iraq, and that he viewed its independence as having been unfair, that Kuwait had always been a province of Iraq, and so in his view, he decided he wanted to reclaim what was rightfully Iraq's. And of course, whether that's correct or not is beyond the scope of this talk. So he, of course, invades Kuwait in 1990. Kuwait is one of the smallest, if not the smallest, oil-rich principality in the world. And of course, those of you who remember 1990 as well, again, everybody who's basically above 35, 40 years old, remember 1990, that it was in 1990 where Bush Sr. basically decided that we are going to liberate Kuwait and we're going to attack Iraq. And that was when Saddam officially switched over from being our ally to being our enemy and opponent, because he decided to invade a country that basically he did not have permission to invade. And so we did launch Gulf War I in 1990 and then early 1991. This was not a full-fledged invasion of the country. Only 100,000 Iraqis died. Only 100,000. Because compared to what's going to happen, 100,000 literally becomes a drop in the bucket. So we only killed 100,000 people, not that big of a deal compared to what's going to happen. As for retaliation, when we wanted to retaliate against Saddam, we then subjected Iraq to an almost total financial and trade embargo, beginning in 1990 and lasting in effect until our next invasion in 2003. So for 13 years, Iraq became a pariah state. It could not buy and sell without our permission, and we prohibited the buying and selling of almost everything and anything imaginable. And it was in this time that Iraq's infrastructure completely decimated. And to give you some examples, and again, all of this is simple history lesson, political science, go look it up, and there's a lot more to be said, but again, because of time constraints, just giving you some tidbits. Why? So that we contextualize, so that we understand what exactly is going on. These people that are members of ISIS, this is what is freakingly scary. These people that are members of ISIS were regular members of society once upon a time. What has happened to them that they're now beheading people and they're not even thinking about the realities of what they're doing? This is not to excuse at all. I'm going to say this point over and over again. This is simply to contextualize the way that when a mass murderer goes and kills a bunch of people in a theater or something, nobody excuses, but one questions what's going on. What happened in his childhood? What exactly, was he exposed to? We're not sympathizing with the mass murderer, but there's always, or almost always, a little bit more to the issue. And we ask ourselves, were there any warning signs? Could that have been prevented, right? And we do this every time some mass murder or some weirdo or something happens. We take a step back and say, oh my God, where did that come from? Well, this is what I'm doing with ISIS, and nobody should misunderstand that this is a type of sympathizing or a type of justification. Not at all. But the point is, the people that are members of ISIS, once upon a time, were regular people of society. They were doing what all of us are doing. So what has happened to them to flip them around to become basically people we can't even recognize their humanity in? And that's what we're trying to contextualize. So as I said, beginning in 1990, the country of Iraq was subject to pretty much a total blockade. No buying, no selling, complete embargo. And that included, by the way, most drugs and pharmaceutics. Basic drugs to live off of, simple pharmaceutical products, which were banned on the pretext that they might possibly be used to build weapons, chemical weapons. Even vaccinations for children, most vaccinations as well were banned. Now, a number of simple facts to talk about the reality of the decline of Iraq. In 1989, the average per capita income of an Iraqi before the embargo was $3,510. Now that's a pretty large amount for a Middle Eastern country in the 80s. So in 1989, the average Iraqi's salary is $3,500. It's a good amount. It's a good amount. Within less than half a decade, we're not even talking about the end of the sanctions. Within less than half a decade, i.e. less than 5 years, the average income plummeted to $450 a year. Now I want to ask you, imagine if your income, $60, $70, $80, $90, $100, $150,000, was not halved overnight, was not quartered, was made 10% of what it is right now. Imagine instead of earning $100,000, you were earning $10,000 a year. Not just that, imagine your currency, the value of it began to inflate 10, 20, 30, 100 times. So you couldn't even stretch your dollar as much as you used to. Now imagine as well that by limiting the importation of common vaccines and drugs, by limiting the importation of water purification resources, hundreds and thousands of people around you, your cousins, your relatives, your mother, your children, began to fall sick, cannot be cured, and begin to die. The United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, the United Nations estimated, this is back in the mid-90s, that at least 500,000 children under the age of 5 died in Iraq as a direct result of having been deprived drugs and vaccinations and pharmaceutical products because of our embargo. That's just a ballpark figure for the number of children that died because they couldn't be given proper medication. Now to give you some other examples as well, Dennis Halliday was an Irishman. He's still alive. He's still a politician in Ireland. Dennis Halliday was an Irishman who had a stellar 35-year career at the United Nations. He's built his prestige, his credentials. He's worked his way up to the top. And he was placed in charge, back in 1992, he was placed in charge of the United Nations humanitarian coordination of the embargo. So he's the UN in charge of the embargo. And he then travels to Iraq for the first time. He's a seasoned diplomat. He's, I don't know if he's been to Iraq before this, but basically comes now, and he's now overseeing the embargo. And within a year, he resigns in protest. Of course, he tried to change. He wrote many letters. He did this and that. Eventually, within a year, less than a year, he resigns in protest. And he wrote a very powerful op-ed, which you can Google and find online. It was published in many newspapers at the time, that he was driven to resignation. He writes, and I quote straight from his article, his op-ed, "Because I refuse to continue to take Security Council orders, the same Security Council that had imposed and sustained genocidal sanctions," quote unquote from his letter, "genocidal sanctions on the innocent people of Iraq. I did not want to be complicit, and I wanted to be free to speak out publicly against this humanitarian crime," end quote. So Dennis Halliday resigned from the UN out of disgust of what is happening in Iraq. Well, okay, it's the UN. Who cares if one person resigns? They replaced him with another seasoned diplomat who actually has some royal blood in his ancestry, a German aristocrat by the name of Hans von Sponik. Guess what? Within a year and a half, another career diplomat, Hans von Sponik, as well resigns from the UN, claiming that these policies, and I quote from his letter as well, violated the Geneva Convention of the humane treatment of human beings. So a second member of the United Nations top echelons resigns out of anger and disgust of what they both call genocide and violation of human rights. And he himself said hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis are dying as a result of our embargo. Not surprisingly, a third diplomat as well resigned, and she was in charge of the World Health Organization, and citing her protest at these policies. And the list goes on and on. During this embargo, the entire infrastructure of Iraq was in effect completely decimated. The health structure, the water system, the electrical, everything was completely decimated. And we don't know what other resignations, what other tragedies might have happened were it not for yet another twist in the story, and that is involving the repercussions, the result of the tragedy of September 11th, 2001. Of course, the tragedy of 9/11 was a great tragedy. There's this before and after moment in our history. It will always remain pre-9/11, post-9/11, and one of the tragedies of our times. And no doubt the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world, all of the world basically balked at the realities of what was taking place. However, we now pretty much know for a fact that this tragedy was intentionally misused to make a completely false and fabricated, knowingly false and fabricated. That's the key point. We now know this. Everybody knows this. I mean, this is public knowledge. The people in charge, and they're members of our own government's administration, intentionally and willingly used the tragedy of 9/11 to link it without a shred of evidence to the country of Iraq. The evidence at the time was extremely specious, and people were questioning it even back then. Now, of course, we know for a fact that there was no evidence. And it was an intentional, blatant lie. And even the former U.S. Secretary of State, General Colin Powell himself, publicly apologized on record. And he himself said that his justification of the Iraqi invasion would, and I quote, forever remain a blot on my record. Now, public apologies are nice, even if it's at least from one person in the administration, but it doesn't change the fact that after 13 years of sanctioning one of the most developed countries in the world, that is now one of the least developed countries in the world, because of our justification of 9/11 linking it to Iraq, we then decided to invade Iraq for a second time. And this invasion was a full-fledged, all-out, no holds barred. And this invasion was an invasion of troops, of weaponry, of military, of planes, of the Navy, and we dropped God knows how many tons of bombs, and the effects of the second Iraq war were still recuperating from that. This began in 2003, 2004. And the effects of that war on our economy, on our troops, frankly, including the PTSD and all the troops that came back, on our image, on our political standing, and a host of other factors. These effects are going to be studied for many generations to come. But let me just quote you one statistic, just one. And that involves how many Iraqi lives were lost as a direct result of our invasion. Just one statistic. And the most thorough study ever done, because our government has a policy of not ever counting the others that have killed. They only count their own civilians and soldiers. They don't count what other populations have been killed. So a non-government affiliated, non-partisan NGO called Physicians for Social Responsibility. Physicians for Social Responsibility. If I'm not mistaken, they're based out of San Francisco, in California. I'm pretty sure San Francisco, but somewhere in California. But the Physicians for Social Responsibility teamed up with another institute, a Nobel Prize-winning institute called the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW. Now this has won the Nobel Prize in a previous decade. And the two of them went on an expedition that lasted over 2-3 years, examining the toll that the war on terror has extracted from the people in Iraq. These investigations concluded, after a number of years of research on the ground, interviewing and statistics and body counts and hospitals, this was the most thorough study ever done of the effects of our invasions in Iraq. And they are published online. You can find them online. Again, these are things, well, everything I'm telling you, you can find it. It's nothing, I'm not inventing anything over here. And this study was published earlier this year, by the way, after a number of years of research, earlier this year. So this is brand new, I believe January or February 2015. So this is very fresh statistics. They said that during the course of the last 12 years, around 1.3 million deaths can be directly attributed to our wars. And then they went on to say, and I quote directly from the report, quote, and this is only a conservative estimate, and it is likely that the total number is over 2 million, end quote. Now, when you get to numbers like 1.2 or 2 million, they simply blur in our minds. To put things in perspective, around 3,000 innocent souls lost their lives on 9/11. As a retaliation, we went and invaded a number of lands, and we caused the direct deaths of over 2 million people. That's like 1,000 for every one. And when you're talking about 2 million people, and this is on the conservative side, you have to understand that for every family in Iraq, that 2 million will affect them. A relative, an uncle, a father, a son, a daughter. It's affecting the Iraqi population. And there are many other things that can be said as well. I've literally, because of time factors, I've literally had to quote selected, statistics and then move on just to make my point. And the point is to ask one simple question. What is my point in all of this? To ask one simple question. Are these factors in any way relevant to what's happening in Iraq? Is it not fair to take a step back and ask ourselves, why has Iraq become the way that it has? What has happened in this land? The brutality, the war, the bloodshed, the violence for the last 30 years non-stop, to see one of the greatest civilizations in the post-World War II Middle East go from where it was to what it is now. After our invasion, of course, we installed one of our puppet regimes, as we like to call them, Nouri al-Maliki. And Nouri al-Maliki, ironically, we claim to have problems with Iran and whatnot. Nouri al-Maliki was actually in Iran as a dissident for over a decade under the time of Saddam Hussein. And he himself is from a Shiite background. He was basically a supporter of Khomeini and whatnot back in the day. And we put him in charge of Iraq. And Nouri al-Maliki turned out to be a disaster of the highest magnitude. During his time, and again I'm summarizing quite a lot of stuff here, look this up yourself. During his time, Nouri al-Maliki went on a rampage against Sunnis. He seemed to have this bitterness against Sunnis. Now, Iraq is a pretty sectarian society, and Sunnis and Shiites have been tense with each other for quite a few decades, and Sunnis are probably 40%, so Shiites have a majority. Now, Saddam technically was from a Sunni background. He wasn't religious at all, but he was from a Sunni background. And he put Sunnis in power in his time. When Nouri al-Maliki came to power, after we put him there, he decided to basically get rid of all Sunni government ministers, all Sunni civilian employees, and basically Shiitize the entire regime. Additionally, he turned a blind eye towards Shiite militias and gangs that were now going on rampages, massacring and slaughtering Sunnis. We have lots of video footage and evidence from the 2005-2006 era of mass protests of Sunnis in Baghdad, in Iraq, against the Shiite regime of Nouri al-Maliki, asking for protection, begging for their jobs back. And Nouri al-Maliki, by and large, ignored this. The militias continued to grow. And I remember this era very well. I was doing my PhD at Yale at the time, and we would hear gruesome stories. Some of my own friends and whatnot would tell me about what happened to their relatives. Everybody knows this in the Muslim community, if you ask them, that the personal stories that began to trickle in of militia gangs just raping Sunnis, killing them in the middle of the night. Now, I want to be fair here. It's a two-way street. Of course, as a response to this, there were also Sunni gangs doing the same to Shiites. We're on the brink of a civil war. But the government, because it was pro-Shiite, seemed to be more harsh on the Sunnis than it was on the Shiites. And the Sunnis, now jobless, by and large, being attacked by the sectarian issues of Iraq, from this chaos emerged a group, a radical group. A group, no doubt, messianic in nature. It's the end of times. There's bloodshed everywhere. People are dying. 30 years of war have gone on. And from this bloodshed emerges a radical group that claims to be fighting for the rights of Muslims, Sunni Muslims, that has this raging hatred of Shiites, that hates America for all that has happened in its country, that is so angry that it wants to kill, 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 because from its perverted worldview, it wants to establish peace for its own people and only its people. Now again, the question arises, where is this coming from? And what really irritates me as a Muslim theologian, I'm an American, I'm a Muslim, what really irritates me is that people immediately jump to the religion of Islam and talk about Islam and ISIS. And they do not even think about the political circumstances from within which ISIS is emerging. It is so easy, it is simplistically, it is naively easy to simply jump and say, oh, those Muslims are doing this. But it takes courage. It takes intellectual courage to take a step back and ask ourselves, what has happened in that region that normal human beings, whatever their faith is, are becoming such butchers, such crazed lunatics? These were Muslims for 1,500, 1,400 years. We've never seen this version of Islam in Iraq or anywhere. Rather than simply selectively misquoting verses from the Quran, the same Quran that the bulk of Muslim world reads, they're not becoming ISIS. Take a step back and ask ourselves, what has happened in that land? And that's where it gets very difficult, because a lot of what has happened there is based on what's happening over here and what we've done over there. Let me give you an analogous situation. An analogous situation about our own country here in America. We're well aware, especially in light of all that's happening with police brutality and violence and whatnot, that there is quite a lot of tension between two large ethnic segments here in America. We're well aware that there's a dominant, broad American population of perhaps around 60 to 70% of one ethnicity, and perhaps around 30% of minority ethnicity. Of course, I'm talking about Caucasians and African American. We're well aware that, yes, there's a dominant and there's a minority of African Americans. When we look at, however, the prison systems, those statistics change. The dominant population in prison is not the dominant population outside of prison, correct? Quite the contrary. Most prisons, many prisons, have populations of 80, 90% African American, 10, 20% Caucasian. Now, faced with these statistics, one can go one of two routes. Simple analogy here. One could say, which was very popular to say 100 years ago, and it's still popular among some circles, oh, it's those people. The dominant culture could say it's their single-family homes, their rap culture, their ghetto, their, and the dominant culture simply blames the minority culture, dehumanizes them. Those people do that. And they blame it on the color of their skin. Of course, these days, thank God, most of us realize that as being racist. 100 years ago it wasn't, by the way. 50 years ago it wasn't. Frankly, in many circles today, it's still considered behind-the-scenes conversation. They blame the culture. And it's so easy, because you know, when you blame the other, you automatically exonerate yourself. You automatically praise yourself. You automatically absolve yourself of any guilt whatsoever. They are dehuman. We are the pinnacle of civilization. Our skin color makes us better than them. That's why we're not the majority of the prison population. We're not the majority of this. We're not the majority of that. But it takes courage to take a step back and ask ourselves, why is there a higher crime rate in their segment of society versus ours? Why is their ghetto system, society, is their ethnicity ghettoized in the city, and we're living in the suburbs and in the more richer areas? And when we do so, all of a sudden we realize, hold on a sec, we might have a lot to do with that. We're the ones who enslaved them. We're the ones who brought them from another land. We're the ones who didn't give them the same rights that we had. They couldn't even vote. They couldn't even, to this day, there's blatant discrimination in job applications and education. And when you take all of those other social and political and economic factors into account, all of a sudden everything clicks into place. It's not the color of their skin. Inherently, a child that has white or black skin is no more or less prone to violence than anyone else. It's not because of the melatonin or lack of it. It's because of social, political, and economic factors that, frankly, the dominant culture is directly responsible for. Those are difficult facts. And thank God, most of America is now becoming to realize that. This is the analogy that I'm also extrapolating to ISIS as well. It is utterly simplistic to blame Islam. To look at these fanatic bearded people saying Allahu Akbar as they chop the head off and say, oh, they're Muslims. My thesis, my point is very simple. Had they not been Muslim, we would have seen the same fanaticism, the same brutality, the same madness. Because where there's been civil war and bloodshed, where there's been bombs, where there's been millions of people killed, where the entire civil society, the infrastructure has been decimated for the last 30 years, you're going to get weird groups coming from such societies. It's not the religion. If they had been Baha'is, Buddhists, if there had been anything, you would have found some type of bizarre scenarios. They wouldn't have been saying Allahu Akbar when they killed a person. No doubt, because that's definitely coming from some Islamic background. But you would have still had gangs, militias. You would have still had people that are out to kill, kill, kill. Because that's the only language they've seen for the last 30 years. And this is the only way forward for them. So again, this does not justify the violence. It's not exonerating the guy who chops the head off. Yes, that person is guilty. We're not saying just because all that's happened, he's allowed to go kill other people. All that we're saying is that in order to solve the problem, find the actual problem, the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is not the text of the Quran. It's not the text of the Prophet's traditions. It is in fact political, economic, social issues that any human being can understand. You don't have to be a Muslim or a non-Muslim. Everybody can understand the realities of that type of frustration. So with that context, let me now get to my final point and then open the floor for some dialogue and discussion. What exactly then needs to be done? What can be done? Well, I view my role as an American Muslim cleric to be rather unsavory. On the one hand, I have to challenge the Islamic radicals. I have to take on my fellow Muslims from around the world who do sympathize with that strain, who do think that somehow ISIS is defending innocent Muslims. And it is my job, and I do not shy away from it, to take on those challenges and to point out the internal, theological, and legal inconsistencies of ISIS. To point out that ISIS really is not faithful to the religion of Islam, that is cherry-picking the text. That is my job, and it is the job of all Muslim clerics. And dare I say, I think that what I have been doing has been successful, at least to some effect, because it is only recently, 2 months ago, that ISIS released a publication in which they mentioned 2 American clerics by name. I was one of them, with my picture in their publication, calling for my public assassination. So nobody can accuse me of shying away from criticizing ISIS. I have criticized ISIS since its inception. My Facebook page, my Twitter, my lectures have been extremely vocal. I have deconstructed their arguments. I have challenged their caliphate to the point of becoming one of only 2 people that have irritated them so much that I have been put on their assassination list. So I am definitely an opponent of ISIS. And I have gotten death threats, and I continue to get death threats from ISIS. But on the other hand, as an American, I must also point out to my fellow citizens of Muslim and non-Muslim backgrounds that even as we criticize the brutality of ISIS and the rise of radical Islam, that it is not my faith alone that causes such radicalism to emerge. Yes, the faith is a justification. Yes, the faith is what they're going to use because these are religious people. And religious people, when cornered, when in a problem, they always use the language of religion. It's not the religion, though, that is causing the anger and the violence. These are religious people. And whatever the problem, it will be expressed in the lens and language of religion. I have to tell my fellow American citizens is that we as a society and nation need to have a very frank and open dialogue about the ethical values, about the repercussions of our own foreign policy. We cannot go around bombing certain civilizations, supporting dictators, putting embargoes on tens of millions of people without seeing some repercussions to that reality. In other words, what is the ethical value of our own foreign policy? And we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, if we're going to interfere with other countries, if we're going to invade other lands, if we're going to support apartheid regimes in the Middle East as we do, and turn a blind eye to the rights of the Palestinians for decades after decades after decades, then people are going to get very angry at us because we're not acting morally, because we are acting unethically and immorally. We cannot become the dictator of the world and assume that everybody is going to understand our worldview. Frankly, when our own worldview is frankly quite indefensible even to our own citizens. And the simple reality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that even our own ex-president Jimmy Carter has come out very vocally calling Israel an apartheid state. talking about, and Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop of South Africa, Desmond Tutu, nobody can accuse him of not knowing what apartheid is, has called Israel an apartheid state. This is Desmond Tutu. He's not a Muslim, he's a Christian Catholic bishop, for crying out loud. Nobody can accuse him of being, soft on Islam or whatnot. He's been under the apartheid regime in South Africa. He is a bishop of the Catholic Church of the highest order, and he has visited Palestine numerous times. And our support of one side against the other, completely sidelining. Now, what has Palestine got to all of this? Here's where I get to another point. I have been very vocal in my criticism of certain aspects of American foreign policy. But you have the right to ask. You have the right to ask, does Islam have anything to do with radicalism? And I will say something that perhaps some Muslims will not particularly like, but I will say it because this is my belief. Yes, certain doctrines of Islam can be misinterpreted, and lead to radicalism. I do not believe those doctrines, if legitimately applied, lead to radicalism. But I do believe there are doctrines within Islam that can be misused to lead to radicalism. And I'll mention two of them. The first of them is jihad. There's no question that Islam talks about jihad. But the term jihad for mainstream Islam is very much like the term fighting for your rights, fighting for your freedom. What did we do in this country 300 years ago with the British? We fought for our rights. We killed British soldiers. We destroyed British property because we wanted our rights. Every society believes in just war theory. There are times where you have to fight. And in Islam, there's no difference. Jihad, for mainstream Muslims, is a legitimate war to defend against your rights to live as a free man, as a free woman. Well, guess what? The people of Iraq don't view themselves as being free. And these radicals think that by fighting others, they can invoke the doctrines of jihad. And they're justified in killing other people so that they can achieve their vision of freedom. I disagree with that vision, but nobody can deny they're quoting texts of the Quran. Yes, they are. I disagree with their interpretation, but yes, the doctrine of jihad is very Islamic, and it is being misused by them. Another doctrine, which is a little bit difficult for many of us to understand, it is a beautiful doctrine if understood properly. It is the doctrine of Ummah, U-M-M-A-H, Ummah. The doctrine of Ummah is a doctrine in which Muslims are taught that fellow co-religionists, other Muslims, are like your kith and kin. They're like your blood relatives. In fact, they're even more dear to you than your blood relatives. That you need to defend the rights of the innocents around the world. That it doesn't matter what their language is, what their skin color is. Any Muslim who's being humiliated, whose rights are being deprived, who's being massacred, that person is your blood brother. And you have a duty, an obligation,